Hey, it's your pal Mike Shea from Flourish. Today, I want to talk about running hordes. How do you run battles with dozens to hundreds of monsters against the characters? Imagine Aragorn standing atop a ruined tower getting attacked by 40 Uruk-hai. Imagine your characters standing on a ruined monastery in the twisted world of Thanatos getting attacked by hundreds of ghouls. Or imagine they pull a skull-capped lever and the ceiling opens up and 200 crawling claws fall down atop them. How do you run battles like this? How are you going to roll attack rolls or track the hit points on 200 monsters, right? How do we do that? We're going to talk about that today. So right up front, I want to offer you the best solution I've come up with for this. I'm going to talk about a lot of different ways to run hordes in your game, a lot of different systems that you can use. You're probably going to find one that you dig. I'm going to tell you about the one that I found works the best. And it comes down to this. There's basically three components. One, track the damage done to the horde. So instead of tracking individual hit points or individual damage done to the monsters in the horde, track the damage that's been done to the horde overall. As soon as that amount of damage crosses over the amount of hit points that a single monster has in that horde, remove one of the monsters. And an easy way to do this is round the amount of hit points that any individual monster has down to the nearest 5 or 10. So that makes it a lot easier to figure out how much damage is required in order to knock a creature out. So you essentially track how many monsters you have in the horde, the hit points of those monsters rounded to the nearest 5 or 10, and then how much current damage has been done. As soon as the damage being done goes up, monsters start to drop off the tally. If you do a lot of damage, let's say you have skeletons and they have 15 hit points each, and a fighter goes up and does 45 points of damage in a huge critical hit, that will kill 3 skeletons. You knock 3 skeletons off and you're ready to go. Using that system where you have total number of monsters, the hit points of an individual monster, and how much done to the horde, you can have as many monsters as you want. And it's not any harder to track the hit points for that. So that's a really good way to track damage. Tracking attacks and saving throws. There's lots of different ways to do this. But the way I like best is just assume 1/4 succeeds. So if a bunch of monsters are attacking a bunch of characters, let's say there's 5 skeletons that are attacking each character in a group, you assume 1/4 succeeds rounded down. So that'd be 1 out of the 5 skeletons actually hit with an attack and do 4 points of damage. You can just do it in your head. You say the skeletons descend upon you, you take 4 points of damage. Now you can scale that up or down. You can round it up or down depending on circumstances. If you have a character who is really low in armor class, maybe they get hit by 1 more. If you have a character who's got a really high armor class, way above, you get hit 1 less. You're essentially assuming that you need about a 15 or a 16 on the attack roll in order to hit. That's about what 1/4 succeeding looks like. If you don't have so many monsters attacking that it's not a burden to roll the dice, go ahead and roll the dice, right? But if you have so many attacks coming in, you're going to be rolling dice forever. Instead, assume 1/4 succeed and roll up or down depending on the circumstances. This works really well for saving throws. Let's say a cleric is at the top of the hill. You're surrounded by 60 skeletons coming up. The cleric holds their holy symbol and holy light goes radiating out from them and hits like 45 of the 60 skeletons, right? How many of those skeletons make their saving throws? 1/4 of them, right? So out of 45, you say roughly 11 of them make their saving throws. All of the others are destroyed, right? And you just remove them from the tally, and 11 skeletons manage to resist the blast. You do that in your head, really easy. That way you don't have to roll 45 saving throws and figure it out. And guess what? It's probably going to come down to around 11 anyway. So that's a really easy, fast way to track attacks and saving throws. Assume 1/4 succeed and round it up or down depending on circumstances. The last trick is how do you adjudicate areas of effect, right? How do you adjudicate positioning in areas of effect? If you're talking to the players about getting attacked by 100 skeletons or whatever, how does positioning matter? So if the characters have figured out how to bottleneck them, account for that. You know, they can't get attacked by more than 5 or 10 at a time. In that case, you might just roll attack rolls like you would normally because it's not so many. If the enemies have bows, though, maybe arrows are coming in and maybe that's a big deal. So if the characters have different positioning, they said we put our tanks up front and our weak people in the back, account for that and say the tanks are the ones getting attacked by the horde. The ones in the back are not getting attacked. Likewise, when they cast an area of effect, try to adjudicate how many you think would be in that area. And you're going to round this way up because a lot of times hordes are packed together. So fireballs are going to hit a whole lot of them. So I have some general ideas. You know, a 5-foot range probably hits about 4. A medium blast like a Burning Hands probably hits on the order of 8. A big area blast like a Fireball on the order of 16, but could be more. And then huge areas like Turn Undead, which has a great big radius. Could be as many as like 32. Just figure it out, and you're going to err in favor of the characters. Choose more rather than less. We're going for huge, heroic action. Go with what's cool, right? Go with the thing that's going to build the most interesting kind of cinematic effect, which is usually more monsters rather than fewer. So why do we care about Hordes? 5th edition's rules, the D&D's rules are there to help us share stories with our friends, stories of high adventure. And one of the stories of high adventure, I brought up Aragorn standing on the hill while a whole horde of Uruk-hai are attacking him. These are common elements in fiction. A small group of heroes facing a huge horde. Think about 300, right? 300 Spartans fighting 100,000 Xerxes dudes. These are common tales. But the 5th edition rules don't really have much to help us with that. They have a couple of things, and we're going to talk about it, but not much. They don't always scale real well. D&D generally expects that you have like somewhere in the order of like 1 to 10 enemies fighting 4 to 6 characters. So we lean towards that because that's what the rules offer. But that, we might have times where they do face 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 1,000 monsters. And we want to have some kind of rule in place to be able to run that. And that's why we're talking about Horde rules today. So to me, when I'm looking at Horde rules, I have sort of 4 main criteria that I want. 1, it shouldn't limit the number of monsters that I can run. I want it to run as many as I want, right? I don't know how many I'm going to want to run. I'm already limited. Don't limit me again by having a Horde rule that only allows me to do 20. Right? It should be easy and fast to adjudicate, regardless of how many monsters. So don't give me a system that's like a little easier, but it gets more and more complicated the more monsters are there. That doesn't really work. It should make the most sense given the mechanics of D&D. We know how D&D operates. We know about attack rolls and saving throws and damage and things like that. So it should work within the framework of D&D and still feel like D&D. And it should also make the players feel like heroes. It should make their characters feel like heroes, not tired and cranky. It shouldn't take 20 minutes to adjudicate a round because you got to roll 40 saving throws against a Fireball. Just say it blows up all the guys, right? So that's what I'm looking for when I look for Horde rules. And there's a lot of different options for Horde rules that are out there. You can find lots of different definitions, lots of different places. The Dungeon Master's Guide, the 5th edition D&D Dungeon Master's Guide talks about this. In Chapter 8 on page 250 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, it talks about how to adjudicate attacks and mostly attacks, but you can actually use the same chart for saving throws. The Dungeon Master's Guide talks about how to adjudicate lots of attacks, and it's got a table here where you essentially take the attack bonus and subtract it from the armor class of the target, and it gives you a target number that you'd have to roll on a d20. And then you look down the list, and let's say it's 15 or 16, it tells you how many monsters have to attack for 1 hit to succeed. The trick is you can flip this table around and use it for saving throws as well, same way. You take the saving throw bonus of the monster that's going to be making the save and subtract it from the DC of the creature the character that's doing the attack. And that gives you a target number. And this tells you how many monsters need to be hit for one of them to save. So you can use the same table either way. If you want to get crunchy about the math, you can use this. For me, generally speaking, when you look at the hordes that are attacking creatures, they're most likely 15 to 16 is the likely attack roll or saving throw that they're going to have to make. You assume that they're significantly weaker than the characters are, so you can just assume a quarter, and then you can scale it up or down if you think it matters. So like crawling claws are probably not nearly as dangerous as skeletons, so maybe it's 1 in 8. Right? But you can slide that ratio up and down depending on the circumstances, and I think it works well. So the Dungeon Master's Guide does talk about this. The unfortunate thing is the Dungeon Master's Guide doesn't have anything about how to track hit points against large amounts of monsters. Other systems do, and we're going to talk about that. 4th edition of D&D had a thing called minions. Minions were essentially monsters that had 1 hit point, and they could not be killed by failed. They could only be killed when they were attacked. A missed attack could never kill a minion. Now, in 5th edition, we could also say a successful saving throw also never kills a minion, right? But they have 1 hit point. The nice thing about this one is you don't have to track hit points at all. There's no damage tally. You know that if a creature takes damage, generally speaking, it dies on the assumption that it was actually attacked and hit. There's a little tricky bit about like, well, what about Fireball? Like if I throw a Fireball at a bunch of minions, shouldn't they all die because they all have 1 hit point? Like, no, the ones that save don't die. And you're like, yeah, but they took 16 points of damage. I rolled a 32-point Fireball, but they don't die. So there's still this cognitive breakdown about like, well, it took damage. And you're like, yes, it did take damage. The hit point is abstract. So it's a nice, simple option. A lot of people like it. I see this come up often, which is just use minion rules and they work really well. My argument is it overvalues low damage attacks. If I throw 5 magic missiles and I spread them out, I'll kill 5 minions. And they undervalues big attacks like a fighter's cleaving sword, where they go in and they 45 points of damage. Like, you killed 1 minion with 1 hit point. Congratulations, right? So it overvalues low damage attacks. It undervalues high damage attacks. There are a lot of options for single stat block hordes where you use like a bigger stat block to represent a lot of monsters. This is also very popular. You could, for example, reskin like a giant stat block, a hill giant stat block, to count as a bunch of goblins, right? So you're getting attacked by 20 goblins. We're going to pack them together, you call it a horde of goblins, but we're using a hill giant stat block. That's okay, but again, you have this cognitive breakdown of like, well, if I fireball them, how many die? And you're like, I don't know, it took a bunch of damage. And then you start to make up rules like, oh, well, we'll say it's vulnerable to areas of effect, right? So it takes more damage, which isn't a thing in 5th edition, but we could add it, right? So maybe it takes more damage from an area effect, and you could still describe that minions are falling over like crazy, but it's the breakdown between the stat block and what's actually happening in the world gets pretty great, and the cognitive dissonance can break down. There's also like positioning and charming and turning and all these other things where it would hit some of them but not others. So I think keeping them still as separate entities works better than trying to pack them into a single stat block. There's an excellent supplement called 5e Hardcore Mode that you can pick up. It's like $3 on Drive-Thru RPG, and you should definitely go pick it up. It's got some really, really interesting rules, really interesting take on how to run 5th edition in this hardcore mode. One of the things it has is how to run minions, and it's got a system that I think actually works pretty well, which is for every monster added to a horde, you increase its attack bonus by 1 and the amount of damage it does by 1. If you have 10 skeletons, instead of doing for the first one would do, have +4 and do 4 damage. You would say for 10 skeletons, it's +13 to hit and does 13 points of damage for 10 skeletons, right? Then when that skeleton horde takes damage, you figure out the amount of damage that was done to it and you divide it by some number. The higher the number, the more powerful the creatures in the horde, right? So 2 would be very weak creatures. That means for every 8 damage done, 4 of the creatures are going to die. But you might say 5, right? And 5 increases, it means for every 20 damage done, 4 are killed. So again, if you have a horde of 20 skeletons, let's say, you might say that we're going to use 5 as the threshold. For every 20 points of damage, 4 of the skeletons are destroyed. And you'll notice that their attack bonus and their damage goes down as they're getting weakened. That's pretty good. It's easy to do. You're using the stat block and just adding some modifiers. I like it a lot. It's a really good approach. I haven't tried it in a game yet, and I think I will. But I think it works well. The tricky bit with that, though, it's not really unlimited. I can't do 100, right? If I do 100, it's plus 104 to hit. There's weird stuff. So I like a system that scales way bigger. 13th Age, fantastic RPG. 13th Age has a system that they brought in, and the designers of 13th Age, one of the designers, Rob Hainsel, worked on 4th edition, so he knew about minions. And they essentially took the idea of minions and called them mooks. But mooks in 13th Age, they have fewer hit points than a normal monster, but they don't just have 1. Instead, you track the damage done to the horde. I took a section right out of the 13th Age SRD here, that mooks are weaker monsters that can be cut down in large number in a single turn. Damage is not tracked against single mooks, but against the entire mob of mooks you're facing. If you roll damage against a mook and it is greater than the single mook's hit points, then another mook takes the remainder. In this way, damage can cascade to multiple mooks, and a player can kill multiple in one turn, even if they're not all directly within the area of attack. So that is, as you can tell, is pretty much the way I talk about handling the damage tally for minions. It scales up as big as you want. It means that small attacks aren't going to just wipe them out too easily, but big attacks can. So it's got a nice scale in it. I really like it. If you were to mix the 13th Age mook damage tracking rules with the table that is in the Dungeon Master's Guide for handling saving throws and attack rolls, you have a good system right there. Two games, both written by professional Dungeons and Dragons designers. You mix the two together, you've got a really good horde system. So taking a look again at the system I brought up in the beginning, it really comes down to 3 things. 1, you track the number of monsters, which can be any number of monsters that makes sense for the story. Track the number of hit points that a single monster in the horde has, like its maximum hit points of any individual monster, and the current damage that the horde has taken. As soon as the current damage done to the horde is greater than the amount of hit points that any given monster has, one of those monsters is killed. If it's double or triple the amount, 3 of the monsters are killed, right? So you can scale that up depending on how much damage they take. Round the monster hit points to the nearest 5 or 10. It makes it way easier to do the math in your head. When you're rolling a lot of attack rolls or a lot of saving throws, and it's more than you want to roll with dice, instead assume 1/4 succeeds. Roll that up or down depending on the circumstances. So maybe it's 1/5, maybe it's 1/8, maybe it's half, depending on the circumstances. If they have advantage, like if you have hordes of wolves and they all have pack tactics, so they all have advantage, maybe it's 1 out of 2. right? If they're all at disadvantage for some reason, now maybe it's only 1 out of 10. So take that ratio and just slide it up or down to whatever feels about right. And that's how many save, or that's how many succeed in their attacks. It works really easy and you don't have to do a whole lot in your head. Figure out how to adjudicate positioning and areas of effect. If the characters go out of their way to set up bottlenecks, or they say that your frontline tank types are in front and the weaker people are in the back, work with that and say, okay, all the attacks are going to come up against those tanks. Think about hallways where it's like, well, only 5 or 6 of the monsters can actually reach you. So only 5 or 6 are actually going to be able to attack. Choke points or other ratios. A lot of times hordes are just not very efficient, so they can't attack. Sometimes they are. If they all have bows or ranged attacks, that could be real trouble. But a lot of times, not all of them are going to be able to attack. Adjudicate that. Also adjudicate how many monsters could be in an area of effect. And it's probably about double what the normal expected amount would be. So if somebody's doing a small burst, maybe it hits 4. If it's a pretty big burst, like a thunder wave, then it could be as many as 8. Fireballs, 16, 20, 30, 24, 32. Decide, like, are they really packed together? If they're really packed together, you can hit a whole lot of them with a fireball. And then huge spells, Circle of Death or Meteor Swarm. Maybe it's all of them, right? Maybe really big spells just hit everybody in the horde. So you can decide how many should be hit. The main thing is adjudicate in favor of the characters. These are about their heroic moments, not them getting beat to death by a horde. It's about showing how powerful they are when fighting huge amounts of weak monsters. So lean in towards the characters. It really works. So there's some problems with this system, obviously. One is you're not really rolling attack rolls, so the damage can feel arbitrary. If you go around the table and say, the horde attacks you, you take 4 damage, you take 4 damage, you take 4 damage, you take 4. They're like, you're not even rolling. You're just saying stuff, right? So it doesn't feel like a normal D&D kind of encounter because you're not rolling attack rolls. There's a couple ways to deal with that. I've looked at them. They ended up not being things that I really wanted to use. But an example would be you could roll 2 attack rolls for the horde, or for each group of the horde, like 2 attack rolls for each person that's getting attacked. And they would take either a quarter of the amount of damage they would normally be getting hit by per roll. It's okay. It's a little fiddly, and you're really just doing it to roll dice. And the end, it's either going to be really swingy and they're going to get hit for a whole lot, or they're going to hit for very little. It's easier, I think, to just assume that a quarter are going to hit. Of the ones that are able to attack, a quarter of them are going to hit. If it's not so many that you can't roll the dice, just roll the dice, right? If you are in a crowded hallway and your main character can only get hit by 5 of them, go ahead and roll 5 attacks. It's fast. Always be using static damage, obviously. Do not roll for damage on hordes. That should go without saying. If you can, roll the attack rolls. Most of the time, it's going to be with big saving throws, like how many are going to save against turn undead. And that's where you want to say, like, maybe it's a quarter, maybe it's 1/5, 1 out of 5, right? Round in favor of the characters. Yeah, so there are other issues. What if they get hit by an area of effect that doesn't do damage, but does a status effect? Like maybe that you throw a sleep on them. Maybe they're hit by hypnotic pattern. How do you handle that? Like, who wants to track, like, oh, well, this group got hit by hypnotic pattern, so they're all going to make saving. Just remove them from play. Just say that those remain dancing around chasing butterflies for the rest of the battle. It doesn't matter, right? They're weak. They're meant to be killed. If somebody's willing to blow a big spell just to do crowd control, let them really control the crowd by just removing those from play. If a cleric casts Turn Undead and it isn't destroying the undead, it's just getting them to run, they run and you never see them again. Even when you're dealing with big areas of effect that don't do damage, you can kind of treat them just like damage. You basically just get rid of them. The same way can work with big spells like Fireball. Let's say that you throw a Fireball on a group of skeletons and you roll 26 points of damage, which means that the skeletons won't be killed if they make their save. It's easier if you just kill them all, right? So it's easier to say your Fireball explodes, you hit 24 skeletons, all 24 skeletons are blown to pieces. Way easier than rolling 24 saving throws and tallying up a bunch of damage. I really like this system. I think it's the easiest system that I've used. I find it tremendously lazy, which, as we know, is a virtue for me. It handles any number of monsters. It is very easy to track. You don't really need any tools on hand. You don't need tables. You don't need calculators. You don't need anything else to figure it out. You can do it all in your head. And you can still run huge battles against lots of monsters. And that's important because that is a very common fantasy trope. When our heroes are standing on a hill and there are hundreds of monsters coming and attacking them, you want to have some system in hand to be able to run that. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please subscribe to the channel. If you really like what you're seeing and you want to help out, you can do so by going to patreon.com/slyflourish and joining my Patreon. Patrons get access to a whole bunch of exclusive guides and tools and tricks for making your D&D game easier. And I want to thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a great day and get out there and play some D&D.